So we are loved. We are loved because God loves us, not because of anything we have done or accomplished, but simply because we are created in God's image. God's love is not something we earn, but something we ought to strive up to. These are the words of Rabbi Shai Held from his latest book, Judaism is About Love. And in this season of tragedy in our community, it feels especially needed. To be reminded that each of us is loved, that each of us has eternal worth, is both a healing balm and a call to live differently. Perhaps it is by divine providence, or as the Book of Mormon prophet Nephi says, a tender mercy of the Lord, that today Rabbi Held is our Kennedy Center speaker. Rabbi Held is one of the most influential Jewish thinkers and leaders in America, serving as the president and dean of the Hadar Institute in New York City. He's received the Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education, been named among the most influential rabbis in America by Newsweek, and among the most prominent Jews in the world by the Forward. His books from Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence to the Heart of Torah, are widely read across all faith traditions. This afternoon, he invites us to reflect on one of the most important and powerful ideas in all of theology, that every person is created in the image of God. Together, we will explore what it means and what that demands of us, both ethically and politically. And at a time when our world is fractured, this message of human dignity and universal solidarity is something we all need to hear. Please join me with welcoming Rabbi Shai Held. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining me today. I want to begin with a simple kind of suggestion. And that is that if we took the Bible seriously, if we really took it seriously, I am not sure we would ever get past the first chapter. The claims that Genesis 1 makes about who and what we are as human beings are so potent, so stirring, so challenging, so breathtaking, really, and so utterly demanding that it's very hard to read it and just move on. The chapter, Genesis 1, demands, it seems to me, nothing less than a radical reorientation of our lives. No biblical idea, I think it's fair to say, has had as much influence as this one. But the idea is, if we're honest, at least on the surface, sort of as vague as it is powerful. And one way you can know that is if you look in the history of Judaism and Christianity, you see just how many divergent interpretations have been offered to what it means. A good clue that it's not so clear what it means. Jewish thinkers have often set out to find some aspect of the human being that they could interpret as the image of God. So Maimonides, for example, says the image of God in the human being is reason and rationality. One modern Jewish thinker says the image of God in a human being, that's the capacity to act from a place of inner freedom rather than being compelled by whatever forces or stimuli are around us. Another 20th century ultra-Orthodox Jewish thinker says, oh, the image of God, that is the capacity to give generously without obsessing about reciprocity. Or to put that in normal language, what will I do for you without obsessing about what you'll do in return for me? Now, there is a lot to be learned from commentaries like this about what these thinkers think is the essence or the core of being human. But traditional Jewish interpretation, Christian interpretation too, veers far from the plain sense of Genesis 1 because, and this is kind of really the first point I want to ask us to sort of consider and sit with, if you will, the image of God is not for the Bible something that we have, but rather something that we are. People don't have an image of God, which is the way medieval thinkers in various traditions often talk. For Genesis 1, the image of God is simply what we are. I am an image of God. I don't have an image of God. In fact, some recent translators, Professor Ellen Davis from Duke, a prominent Christian Bible scholar, actually translates Genesis 1:26 not as let us make humankind in our image, but rather let us make humankind as our image. right? Which has a very different feel and a very different ring to it. One of the reasons this is so important, the idea that we are images of God rather than having images of God, is that that does not allow us to reduce human beings to kind of ethereal floating spirits who just happen to have bodies, which is sometimes the way religious teachers talk, right? It says we are, all of us. What I sometimes say to students, and I don't know if I can say this in Utah the way I say it in New York, your leg is part of the image of God. Now, we can then struggle with what that means, right? But it's not just the most beautiful part of you, the soul that, your partner falls in love with. No, your whole self, your concrete embodied self is an image of God. Scholarly research on what it means to be created in the image of God has burgeoned, you could really say exploded, in recent decades, although there is still a lot of disagreement and debate. I want to try to offer a little bit of a kind of theological synthesis of what a lot of people think this means and what implications it might have for how we think about our ethical obligations and our political decision-making in the world. So perhaps the most radical thing to understand about Genesis 1 depends on knowing something about the ancient Near East. Because the minute this lands, I find, honestly, this takes my breath away. In ancient Near Eastern societies, almost to a head, the king of that society was considered the image of the god that society worshipped. And that meant that it was the king who was appointed by that god to rule over that god's people and to mediate the god's blessings for the people. This meant that from the very creation of the world, some of us were meant, destined, created, you might say, to rule over others of us. And then you take a minute and you pause and you think about what happens here. And you realize Genesis 1 will have none of this. It is not the king who is an image of God. It is every last human being on the face of the earth without exception. Here's another way to say the same thing. If you want to say in the ancient Near East that kings are images of God, then every human being on the face of the earth is a king or a queen. We are all royalty. There is no human being who is not royal. That is the if you want to sort of say this in fancy philosophy speak, the theological anthropology of Genesis 1 is a claim that each one of you in this room is royal. Right? I mean, that's the thing. You're all of us. All of us are royalty. The logic of Genesis 1, if you want to follow it, if you look at Genesis 1:26, right? That was somewhere between magic and divine providence. Let us make humankind in our image after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea. What happens there is all of us together are given the task of ruling over the rest of creation rather than some of us being given the task of ruling over the rest of us. Is that clear? Give me a nod. If you're right. That's the move, if you will, that Genesis 1 makes. You call this a subversion of what the ancient Near East thought. Now, a 1-minute sidebar, just because I feel like there's a lot of, for good reason, sort of energy around this. It's crucial to be clear in an age of climate crisis and even emergency, right, that being appointed to rule over creation is decidedly not the same thing as being given carte blanche to do whatever we want with the creation. And in fact, what's so striking here is that if you look at the Bible's vision of how kings are supposed to act, not how they do act, but how they're supposed to act, their primary task is to look after the well-being of the poorest and most vulnerable subjects they have. So if we take the idea that human beings are meant to be the rulers of creation, so far from being even licensed to do whatever we want with it, it's actually quite plausible to say the very opposite. It's being given the responsibility for the well-being of all of creation. I do not have to go out on a limb to say we have done a poor job of this so far. Okay, now, next step, right? The democratization or egalitarianization, if you prefer, of the image of God entails another democratization, and that is the democratization of moral responsibility. Because, in the logic of what I just said, in the ancient Near East, it was the king who was responsible to take care of the most vulnerable members of society. If you want to look this up in the Hebrew Bible, you can take a look at Psalm 72 as a kind of almost vestigial text where the king of Israel is described as the one who protects the rights of all the most vulnerable members of society. But if it's now true that we are all kings and queens, then all of us together are responsible for the well-being of the most vulnerable members of society. For the Bible, there is no such thing as passing the buck upwards. It wasn't me. It was like, I don't have any power. It was the people. I didn't do anything. That's not how the Bible imagines what it means to understand ourselves as images of God. Now, we can go another step. If you look at this verse, right, you see, verse 27, that the Bible, Genesis 1, stops and goes out of its way to say, in Hebrew, Zachar u'nekeva bara'otam, in English, right, God made them both male and female. So the idea here, I think, is quite striking, and it's a challenge to all religious traditions, actually, that stem from the Bible. No matter how deeply entrenched gender hierarchies are, Genesis 1 wants to say they're not built into the very fabric of the universe, right? We are all royalty regardless of gender. It's not just all men, it's all men and all women. So imagine for a minute, imagine stopping and taking this to heart. Right, this is where I started. If we took this seriously, and I have a lot more to say about this, but if we took this seriously, already you can see how hard it would be to ever move on to the next chapter, right? Consider the awe you feel in the presence of a person who has great power or renown. Consider the deference you may be inclined to show them. And then imagine that Genesis 1 is inviting each one of us to feel the same sense of awe in the presence of every human being we ever come across. I was not planning to say this, but it's maybe useful to say, one time, and through some ridiculous circumstance, I ended up invited to a party at the White House, right? And here's the only thing about that party that I remember or thought was actually like worth anything. It was so interesting. This was when President Obama was the president. All these people are in the room, 90% of them are very wealthy, like banker types, donors to the Democratic Party. And these, as you might know, are people who probably think they're very important, right? The door opens at one point, President Obama walks out, and in the moment that he walks out, you hear in the room an audible gasp. So interesting to me. What's the audible gasp? Oh my God, a person with unimaginable power just walked into the room. For me, it was like an unbelievable lesson in how you can be like so powerful and think so much of yourself and so influential, and yet there's something about people with status that, for better or for worse, probably for better and for worse, affects us. What I'm suggesting is the way those men in their fancy suits responded to President Obama is the way we are invited by Genesis 1 to respond to each other. That's like a lot. It's a lot to sit with and take in. And I want to say it perhaps in a somewhat inflammatory way. A homeless man on the street, this is a very Manhattan example, but a homeless man on the street sleeping in his own urine is worthy of the same respect and is royalty to exactly the same extent as Barack Obama or Joe Biden or whoever it might be. That's a really intense claim that is worth sitting with, and in very obvious ways. That is both an ethical teaching and a political one. Political in the sense not of like this tells you exactly who to vote for on what issue, but what are the values that ought to orient us when we think about the political sphere? Whose interests do we have in mind when we seek to put people and parties into office? But let's return for a minute to Genesis 1, because we're far from done just with these verses, okay? And here I'm gonna push on a point that I've been arguing for the last few years. I worry that what I'm about to say can be misunderstood, but I'm going to sort of take the risk and then tell you what I hope you won't take from this, okay? There may be an intriguing connection, I think, between the biblical prohibition on making icons and visual representations of God on the one hand, and the idea that human beings are created in the image of God on the other. And this occurred to me this is not an idea that is original to me, so I don't mean to make it sound that way, but this sort of landed with me when I realized that one of the terms for a prohibited idol in biblical Hebrew is slamim, or images. That is the Hebrew plural of the word tselem, the singular of which is image. Tselem Elohim is what we are, the image of God, right? So you can't make slamim, and when the prophet Isaiah says, who could you compare me to, that is, says it in the name of God, here's God saying it, he says, there is nothing that can be a demut, a likeness of me. Image and likeness are words that are both invoked to describe why idolatry is so problematic. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the great Jewish thinkers of the 20th century, who I had the privilege to write my first book about, was invited to the White House in the early 1960s, and he gives this speech in which he makes this completely arresting comment. Here's what he says. There can be no man-made symbols of God, but that doesn't mean that there can be no symbols of God at all. There is something in the world that the Bible does regard as a symbol of God. It is not a temple or a tree. It is not a statue or a star. The symbol of God is the person, every person. The startling implication, this is me talking now, not Heschel, is that God is revealed to us not primarily, or if you're Jewish, not at all, through carved wood or sculpted stone, but through the human being right in front of us. And I hasten to add, including the one who drives you crazy. Right? I always like to say to people, it is not only people you like who are created in the image of God. Right? The lesson is people you don't like. Right? So in other words, this is the claim I'm sort of advancing about one of the logics, if you will, of Genesis 1, is that producing an image of God is prohibited, not because there may be none, but because there may only be one. The one that God self made. God is the one who makes images of God, not us. And the image of God that God makes is you, not some picture that you're going to draw, no matter how beautiful, or not some sculpted stone or molten, cast mold that you're going to make. That means that idolatry, at least I'm proposing this, is not only, as it were, a sin against God, but is also an interpersonal violation. Because you cut out that which makes a human being's status utterly unique in the universe. When you make a picture of God, you take away from a human being their utterly unique status as the only thing on earth that is as close as we come to a representation of God. Now, I'll push this point just a tiny drop further, building on the work of a Christian Bible scholar named Richard Lintz. Making idols is not just, he says, an attack on the dignity of humans. It's also a refusal of the responsibility that comes with being an image of God. And that is because, as images of God, we are meant to be reflectors. But when we make images of God, inevitably we become the reflected. Because everything that comes out of our imagination on some level reflects us. But our job is not to make reflections of ourselves. It's for us in our lives to be reflections of the God we aspire to worship. It's like a total flip. It turns it on its head. If you prefer, you could say to make images is to run the risk of worshiping the created instead of the creator. We are meant to be images, not to make them. Okay? I'll take this even one step further, just to sort of push this for a second and say there was a German Bible scholar in the last century named Gerhard von Rad, the most German name for a scholar ever. Gerhard von Rad actually said this thing. He said, evidence shows that in the ancient Near East, when a king was a king over a vast empire, and he simply couldn't be in many places at once, he would order images of himself to be sculpted and leave them in the various places that he ruled. And Farrar argued in this really provocative thesis, maybe that's what Genesis 1 is saying about us. Right? And this is a little bit maybe excessively anthropomorphic, but like God is the king over a very vast amount of property, if you will. God, as it were, can't be everywhere all at once. So you know what God does? God drops us all over the world to be the physical representations, the visual representations of God. Now, I already asked you 5 minutes ago to stop for a minute and take in what it would mean to take this seriously. I want to sort of invite you to do that again now, right? Right? It is not only that in Genesis human beings are given the status of kings. That's true too. It is also that human beings are given the place that in other cultures are given to statues. The Jewish Bible scholar Ben Sommer says, where the ancient Near East had statues, the Bible had people. Really kind of an amazing statement, right? That was the kind of the theology of human dignity. There is a midrash. Is that a term that's familiar to people? A midrash is a kind of rabbinic elaboration of the meaning of the Bible. I don't know why this midrash is not more famous. I have to be honest, at the risk of oversharing for a minute. I think about this all the time, sort of wonder what it would be like for me if I actually could really internalize this. The Midrash says, whenever a person is walking on the road, there is a retinue of angels walking in front of him that says, make way, for an image of the Blessed Holy One is passing. So just what would it mean to live like that? The mindful attention it would require to the dignity of the people you pass on campus, the people you don't pass on campus, the people you see and the people you actively unsee, right? What would it mean to do that? I've argued in my own writings, for whatever it's worth, that sort of biblical ethics begins with that claim, and that any ethical tradition that draws on the Bible ought to begin from that claim too. That is, when a person is walking by you, I don't mean that you have to take this literally, although you're welcome to, but like a retinue of angels walks by and says, wait, hey, like, do you not realize what this is? Do you not realize what this is? One of the places, by the way, that Jewish kind of normative ethics takes this is to a complete obsession with the prohibition on humiliating another person under any circumstance. Because the notion that you would cause sort of shame and humiliation to a visual representation, forget about the visual for a minute, to a representation of God is a kind of is a almost unimaginable crime. So I find myself constantly inviting people to ask the question: if I took the Bible seriously, how would my life be different if I strove to live by this? How would the life of my community, my nation, my political party, whatever associations you feel, my knitting club, it doesn't matter, right? How would we conduct ourselves in ways that were appropriate? That was not meant as a knock on knitting clubs, just an expansive inclusion. Okay. So all of this, I want to sort of say it in the following kind of abstract sounding way and then say it like a normal person. All of this raises the stakes of the interpersonal realm kind of beyond what most of us almost ever actually consider. That is to say that the interpersonal is sort of irreducibly theological, right? Or to say that like a normal person, the way I interact with other people is de facto how I am in part interacting with God. You can't say, God, I love you, but people I could do without, right? There's no religious person I've ever met who has not been tempted at some point to say just that, right? But you can't actually allow yourself to do that. There's a wonderful essay by a 20th century ultra-Orthodox rabbi. This is not grammatically correct, but it almost doesn't matter. He connects the Hebrew word for image, tselem, with a similar sounding Hebrew word, tzel, which means shadow. And what he says is, right, this means that a human being is God's very shadow. And since a shadow cannot appear without a presence that is casting it, every time you encounter a human being, you have to know God is right there. Otherwise, you wouldn't be seeing this shadow. That's like a lot to live with. And one of the things I will say, and if we want to talk about this during the Q&A, we can. I think the question of how this is true, as far as I can tell, in every religious tradition I've ever encountered anything about, how do I enable teachings like this to be inspiring, uplifting, and genuinely challenging without them becoming crushing in like, oh my God, what if I actually tried to take this seriously? I had a student say to me recently, now I'm really in the realm of oversharing, but I had a student say to me recently something that I found so just intense. I gave a series of lectures at Hadar, the institute that I run, to a group of college students about different Jewish aspects of the image of God. And a woman came up to me with tears in her eyes and said, Rabbi Held, do you not understand? You are teaching this in a society that is Sodom. How am I supposed to go about my day? I'm going to walk out of this building and there's people lying on the street with nowhere to sleep tonight. And you just told me that like the essence of theology is to actually for that to be the most. So how? And in the most annoying thing that a teacher can possibly do, I was like, well, all I can really say is that is really the right question. It's like that now you're asking a theological and religious question. And I hope you can all see why that theological question is ethical and political all the way down. Right? Where's the line there between theology, ethics, and politics? I don't see it really. Right? Okay. Now, in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip a little and just say a couple more things. One is, while Jewish theology insists that the ethics, the honor of a person is, as we've seen, totally bound up with the honor of God, Jewish sources going back to the book of Proverbs, actually you could even say going back to the Pentateuch, but it's explicit in the book of Proverbs, really emphasize that the dignity of people who are poor is even more explicitly and urgently bound up with God's dignity. So for example, the book of Proverbs says, one who oppresses the poor insults his maker. One who shows pity for the needy honors his maker. Or another verse, he who mocks the poor insults his maker. And what is hard to translate in English, because English doesn't work as well as Hebrew and some Romance languages for this, is that the poor in these verses is always in the singular. It's not a category, it's a person. I once had a person come up to me after a lecture I gave. This is a person I have nothing but admiration for. He has spent his whole life doing sort of interpersonal work with people who are impoverished. And he said to me, I cringe every time you speak of the poor as a category. The poor is not a category. It's poor human beings. The poor enables us to remove ourselves from the reality that it's actually someone just like you with dreams and hopes and aspirations. Don't ever say the poor. It's unbecoming to speak that way. I found that like very daunting to try to live up to, but that came back to my mind as I was thinking about the book of Proverbs. It refuses to talk about the poor in the plural. And it's not that poverty isn't a social issue, but it's almost like it wants to remind us that almost before it's a social issue, it's a human issue about individual humans. And I'll even say something else here. If you want to look this up, I maybe should have asked to have a slide of this. This is Proverbs chapter 17, verse 5. He who mocks the poor insults his maker. There's a wonderful ambiguity there. Whose maker? He who mocks the poor insults his maker. The subtle claim is my maker and the poor person's maker, same person. Okay, same God, right? And so, now why? Why do Jewish texts emphasize the dignity of people who are poor more emphatically than the dignity of anyone else? I think that's simply about a reality of what human beings do all the time, right? It's a kind of attempt to do a counterweight to how we all, I don't want to implicate any of you, but most of us, at least some of the time, right, end up somehow imagining that people's economic status has some implication for their metaphysical status. And that is, in religious terms, a sacrilege. One of the things that I think about a lot, and this may be new to many of you, but one of the laws that Jews observe on Shabbat, or traditionally observant Jews observe on Shabbat, you can't handle money. We don't buy things, we don't sell things, we don't carry money. And it only in the last year or two has sort of really occurred to me that that's not just about, leaving the world as it is and not like manipulating the world through commerce. It's actually a way of reminding ourselves that how much money we have has no real bearing on how important we are. So that when I walk into a synagogue, the richest member of the congregation and the poorest member of the congregation have the same amount of money in their pocket. It's a ritual enacting of a theological truth. Does that make sense? Does that resonate? Make sense? Okay. Let me take just another couple of minutes. I want to just push this yet one step further. Okay? So, if you were to read this chapter, you would see that it is at times like a hymn to biodiversity. God, according to Genesis 1, does not just create animals. God creates animals of every kind. God creates birds, not just birds, birds of every kind. God creates plants, not just plants, plants of every kind. And the Hebrew repeats itself over and over again, limino, liminam, liminehem, again and again and again and again. And then you get to the end of the chapter, if I'm remembering correctly, it's 5 times you've heard this phrase, in all their kinds, and you get to the creation of the human being, and you expect, and God created humankind in all of their kinds in God's image. And the of all kinds never happens. Now this is actually a form of biblical study that's called rhetorical criticism. Like you're expecting to hear, right? It's almost like a chorus that keeps reappearing, and then imagine you hear a song, and then at the end of the song, you wait for the chorus, and there's no chorus. And you're like, wait, what just happened? I think that's actually what you're supposed to experience in hearing Genesis 1. And here's the amazing thing that I think Genesis 1 wants to say. There are no kinds of human beings. And that is a frontal, I would say, theological assault on what's wrong with all of us and the lives we lead and the societies we construct. There are no kinds of human beings. Right? Later on, the Bible will very much focus on particularity. I'm going to talk about this in my lecture tonight. The Bible will very much focus on particular identities, languages, cultures, and the valuing of human diversity. But before it values diversity, it wants to lay a stake in the ground for what? Shared humanity. If all you talk about is diversity without first having a commitment to shared humanity, diversity can very quickly turn into warfare, into monstrous behavior. So the beginning is the claim, no, but first let me just say, every human being everywhere is the same species, right? Every human being everywhere is the very same species. And in fact, one of the great rabbis in the modern period, a man named Rabbi David Frankel, actually makes the case. If I had more time, I would show you this, how he builds this out of the text, but sort of wants to say the fundamental principle of the Torah, and here when Jews say the Torah, they don't just mean the 5 books of Moses, we mean the whole vast corpus of things that have ever been said by God to Jews and by Jews about God. The fundamental claim of the Torah, he says, is that we're all family. The person you've never met, who speaks a different language, has a different color skin, maybe worships God totally differently or doesn't worship God at all, is actually part of your family. That's actually where it starts. Everything else you say after you say that. I read something a few years ago that I found really interesting, just related to this, where I am not scientifically qualified to evaluate this, but this science writer I was reading said, the DNA of any 2 people in the world differs at most by about 0.2%. It's just really interesting, almost like a biological confirmation, if you will. I'm using that term kind of loosely, but a kind of biological reflection of this idea that we really are all family. very last point, and then I'm going to stop. The Bible does something else that you can only understand by knowing something about the ancient world, and that is that in every ancient society that we know of, every ancient Near Eastern society, I should say, the society would tell a creation story which culminated in the creation of the society telling the story. Should I translate that into English? Was that clear? So like the Babylonian creation story culminates in the creation of Babylonia and its king. When you study ancient Near Eastern history and you realize that, at a certain point, like, it kind of takes your breath away and you realize Genesis 1 deliberately doesn't do that. Ancient Israel was the only society in the ancient world that told a creation story in which the society telling the story played no role in the creation story. Right? The land of Israel and the people of Israel are not primordial in Genesis. Or to put that in yet another way, Genesis begins with Adam, not Abraham. That's a clear choice. It begins with humanity, not with the Jewish people. And then you realize that, in a book that's going to be very interested in particularity, first there is a universal horizon. There is, again, another way of saying shared humanity. The Bible scholar John Levinson calls this, it's a wonderful phrase, the universal horizon of biblical particularism. The Bible will talk about particular identities proudly, unapologetically, as a value. But again, only by first saying, yeah. But first, as a foundational layer, there is this claim that we're all human first. And that is what actually led me to my title, is this claim about solidarity. Now, solidarity is not a word, I don't even know how you would say that in classical Hebrew. It's not like a traditional Jewish word. But by solidarity, I simply mean some raw sense that you and I are connected all the way down, kind of, if you will, both biologically and theologically. Right? If you want to say this in very traditional language, Genesis 1 wants to say we all have the same father, small f, Adam, and the same father, God, capital F. Like, that's kind of the argument. And I will tell you, since I'm in a building where I think people study political science, that when the political scientist Kristen Monroe, who studied Germans who saved Jews during the Shoah, during the Holocaust, what she talks about is the one thing that came up in almost every interview she did is that she would say to people, why did you do this? Why did you risk your own life to save people? And she says the thing that would not, she says something like, the answer that would not go away was that people would say, what do you mean? They are humans too. Like, what are you asking me? I didn't do anything heroic. I did something that was obvious, right? I feel like that, for me, lands in such a deep way because I feel like maybe that's an instantiation of what this text wants us to consider learning. What do you mean how people are treating some, immigrant who doesn't speak the same language and has a different color skin? What do you mean that's my responsibility? No, it isn't my responsibility. They're a human being just like me. They're my family. They're an image of God just as I am. They're a king, right? How do you treat a king? How do you treat a queen? How do you actually do that? And so I hope that we can consider what it would be like to, from a religious perspective, refuse to treat humans as fundamentally separate, atomized, unrelated, unconnected, not responsible to each other, for each other. And actually consider that part of what it means to take the theology of the Bible seriously is to know that the very opposite of that is true, right? We're not atomized, we're bound up with each other. We're not separate, we're entwined. And if we're anything in the world, it's that we're responsible to God for each other. On one level, that's a fact from a theological perspective. And on another level, it's, to borrow a phrase from the great Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, the task of a lifetime to internalize it and live by it. Right? To internalize the idea there's no human being I will ever encounter who is not on some level my family, and therefore someone for whom I am responsible. And the kind of relationship I have with God will be reflected in exactly how I interact with that person. Thank you.
So we have, first of all, thank you. That was so beautiful. We have about 10 minutes for questions. We have some microphones in the back. If you could tell us your name and your major, where you're from, we'd appreciate that. So again, about 10 more minutes. Thank you.
Great. Please. I've silenced you all.
I'm Emma. I'm studying political science, and I'm from Canada. And my question is just, in North America, we've seen specifically the decline of Christianity, and with these ideas that you shared that are so rooted in theology, how do we advocate for this kind of thing in a way that resonates with people who don't necessarily believe or care to even have any interest in religion or theology?
Thank you for that. I feel like, and I mean this as a compliment, that's not one question. That's like a net of several really important questions. No, it's great. I mean, it's like the question in a way. So let me start by saying something deeply offensive and then say something that's maybe more constructive. The deeply offensive thing is part, not all, but part of the decline of religion earned. Because religion hasn't been very often or often enough about the things that we're talking about. And so there are people who walk away from religion precisely because they think religion's function in the world is to contribute to the opposite of this, right? I just think it's important to acknowledge that, because the first thing is, the first way to get people to take Christianity or Judaism or whatever seriously is to ask, well, what kind of model of what Christianity or Judaism are am I putting forth into the world? Right? I mean, sometimes when I listen to young adults who tell me I'm not religious anymore, and then I say why, I cringe inside, because it's sort of like, yeah, I get it. Right? So I think it's important to really acknowledge that, because it's not just about sometimes religious people talk as if, well, if I could just convince people of the following things, the world would be better. And that might be true, but I would also say, well, if I could just build communities that embody certain things better, religion might be more attractive. This is my first and last visit to BYU. Now, to your point, I think there's two answers two responses to this. I mean, or there's probably many. One thing that assuming that modernity is not going away anytime soon, and that not everyone is going to be, seeking out a personal relationship with God in the next 6 months, right? So then I think we also have to ask, how can we actually foment people who do not see themselves as religious actually finding ways of talking about similar ideas in secular terms? Do I personally think that you can arrive at as robust a vision of this in secular terms as you can through theology? I don't actually think that. And actually, I would actually say, for me, that's actually one of the things that makes me a believer, is actually this maybe works in the opposite direction. I feel like if anything seems true to me about the world, like in my deepest experience of the world, it's that human dignity is a real thing, and that human beings are infinitely precious, and the best sense I can make of that is actually God. But I am rooting for people who do not have a relationship with God to develop more and more robust ways of talking about human dignity, because otherwise we're all going to kill each other in the end. And so I hope that I don't want to lose either pole of that, right? I mean, it's actually one of the things that makes me a believer, but given that most people are not going to be believers anytime soon, and it's actually very interesting, this, you may know this, but this is an ongoing debate in human rights theory. If you actually want to look this up, you might enjoy this. A human rights theorist named Michael Perry, right? Michael Perry has this famous essay that it created havoc in human rights theory. The essay is called "Human Rights Are Ineliminably Religious." And he basically says this very theological thing. He says, where do they come from? What are we talking about? Every human being in a pre-political way has a set of inviolable rights. He's like, without God, how on earth would we get there? And the human rights theory world was like, I don't know why you're wrong, but you're wrong. Right? I mean, I remember once quoting Michael Perry at a conference at Princeton University, and this Israeli political philosopher, very secular, turns to me in the middle of my talk and goes, "Lo," which is Hebrew for no. Right? It was amazing. I was like, wow. Now, but so the point is that even in philosophy, we argue about this, right? Where does dignity come from? But there's again that paradox, right? Oh, we need God for dignity, but people who follow God are often the worst assailants on human dignity. So there's just a lot that's what I meant by a net of questions, like a lot of things we have to unravel to get this right. It's not just a philosophical question, it's an everyday conduct question. Have I lived my life in such a way that makes belief in God seem more attractive rather than the opposite? I think that's a very profound religious question, which I hope all young adults who are coming into their own as religious people ask themselves, or are asked by their teachers. Like, the way I handle myself in the grocery store affects other people's perception about whether it makes sense to believe in God. It just does, right? In the most obvious ways. Okay. Please.
Okay, my name is Libby Jardine, and I'm in the pre-business program right now. So my question is, what actions can we begin taking to be able to change our mindset to see every individual person as made in the image of God?
I really appreciate that you asked it that way, because I thought you were going to say, what political steps can we take? And then I was like, oh my God, So here is So I'll tell you about an experience that I had. It was actually the same week that young woman came up to me and said, "You're teaching this in Sodom," right? Which I mentioned earlier. Is that I got a note from a student who said to me, I feel that I should tell you that I got to sleep really late tonight because I was on my way home from the summer program, and I saw a man on the street who was homeless, and I kept walking. And then I thought to myself, sorry, this is hard for me to talk about without crying. He said, then I thought to myself, okay, what would I do now if I actually thought about what we learned today? And he said, I just came home from spending 4 hours sitting on a grate in Manhattan asking him to tell me his life story. And I just listened. And I thought to myself, now there's a kid who, if I can use a Jewish language, really learned some Torah today. Right? Now, he will never look at a homeless person the same way again. Right? And that's like a lot. So I actually feel like deliberately, a lot of the things I talked about were sort of my, it's just one person's, but suggestion about some of how we might do that. Like, when I walk into a room and there is one person who no one says hello to. Like, I sometimes say this in synagogues, like, we can talk about how the outsider is the new immigrant who has no one to welcome them, but there is someone standing in this service who has basically no one who says hello to them after services, because they're weird, because maybe whatever it is, right? Like, how do I, attune myself to become the kind of person who's like, oh, that's the person I'm going to talk to, right? It's actually like, Aristotle wonderfully talked about how ethics is about habituation. Training myself. That's where we get the term second nature from. Is this familiar to people? Right? The whole notion of second nature is Aristotle thought that was, you have a first nature, and then you train yourself to behave in certain ways and to perceive in certain ways, and eventually you acquire a second nature, which is the nature that you've cultivated for yourself. It feels to me, to your question, that to see people as having dignity and sort of demanding respect is a process of habituation. It's training myself to see differently. And one of the things I'll just say, one of the things I wrote about in my book that was really new to me, a lot of the things in my book, Judaism is About Love, were things I'd been thinking about and writing about for literally 2 decades. And one of the things core things really came to me only as I was finishing the book. I came to realize that I had talked a lot over the years about love as a way of acting, and love as a way of feeling, and love as a way of willing. But I had never really made explicit enough that love is also a way of seeing. Love is about training your eyes to see people in particular ways. When I see a man on the street who's homeless, I don't see a homeless guy. I see a man on the street who doesn't have anywhere to go. Or if you prefer, I see a king. And it's really about, right? Or even on a more direct interpersonal level, when I see someone who, let's say, tries my patience, sometimes I think, oh, this is a person whom God loves infinitely. Maybe I could get over myself right now. That's daily work. That's hour-to-hour work. I would go so far as to say that is like at the very heart of what it means to live a spiritual life, is like that work. That, to me, that's the first set of steps. It's all about like, how do I, right, orient myself to the presence of other people and their reality.